Okay, so welcome to this next video in the playlist on the heart. In this video, what we're going to do is look at the role of the Sarcoplasmic Reticulum, or the SR, in pathological cardiac hypertrophy. Okay, right, so we're going to see a few experiments which show that in pathological cardiac hypertrophy, the Circa-2 pump doesn't work as well, and this results in a lower concentration of calcium being stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, and this lower store of calcium intracellularly means that the calcium spikes that occur inside the cardiomyocyte every time an action potential arrives there are smaller, and this is what leads to a lower force generated when the cardiomyocyte contracts. So the structure for this video is, we'll start with a basic introduction of what pathological cardiac hypertrophy is, a little reminder of what it actually is. Okay, we'll then look at this first component, potentially, of why a hypertrophied cardiomyocyte is less capable of generating force when it contracts, i.e. why is it less good at doing its job, which is dysfunction of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, right. So we'll start off with a basic reminder of what pathological cardiac hypertrophy is. So, if we draw our heart here, okay, so here is the right atrium, here is the right ventricle with the pulmonary trunk coming out there, here is the left ventricle here, and then here is the left atrium here, and then coming out of the left ventricle is the greatest artery of the body, the aorta. So let's just label these up. This is the left ventricle, this is the left atrium, this is the right ventricle, this is the right atrium. Right, okay, so pathological cardiac hypertrophy is an alteration in the structure of the cardiomyocytes that make up the walls of the heart. Okay, so what drives it? Well, basically what has to happen is something has to cause the heart to struggle, okay, to perform its role. So, for instance, let's take the left ventricle here as our prime example, and let's have a look at the sort of things which could potentially lead to the left ventricle struggling. So, basically, the left ventricle's job is to expel the blood into the aorta. Now, why would it have a hard time doing this? Well, if the aortic blood pressure is far too high, so if, for instance, aortic blood pressure is far too high and it's chronically too high, so if the person has chronically high blood pressure known as hypertension, okay, so aortic blood pressure is too high, the fancy word for this is hypertension. So if the person has chronic hypertension, then the left ventricle is going to be pushing blood into an aorta that already has a very high blood pressure in it. So the amount of energy it's going to have to use to expel that blood into the aorta is going to be larger, so the force that the heart's going to have to generate is going to be bigger. So this could be a reason why the heart is struggling. Okay, so I'll just write causes the heart to struggle, specifically the left ventricle to struggle. So these principles work for all four chambers, but we'll examine the left ventricle because that's the main chamber of the heart. Okay, so if the aortic blood pressure is too high, then the walls of the left ventricle are going to struggle to expel the blood into the aorta. Okay, right. What else could cause the heart to struggle? Well, if you have survived a heart attack, this could cause the left ventricle to struggle. So, a heart attack. And the fancy word for a heart attack is a myocardial infarction. So, myocardial means pertaining to the heart, or to the myocardium, which is the name for the muscle of the heart. And infarction means dying due to lack of blood supply. Okay, so myocardial infarction means that a portion of the heart's muscle has died due to a lack of blood supply. So, let's show this on our picture. What if a great big lump of the left ventricle has died? Okay, so this great big lump of cardiac muscle cells have died, and they've now been replaced by connective tissue, basically. So it's just connective tissue, it's not contractile tissue. And this is because the heart, basically, once you have been born, there is little, nearly no cell division in the heart. So there is a tiny bit of cellular proliferation in the heart after birth, but basically, as a general rule, there's so little that it's trivial. Okay, so as a general rule, most of the heart cells of your heart you will have had since birth, basically, and that's an incredible thought, that the same cell is doing the same thing since birth, and it will continue to do the same thing. It will live as long as you live, basically. So the heart has a very low level of proliferation, and this means that if a huge, great number of the cells of the heart die, you can't replace them, basically, because you have no cellular proliferation. That's why the heart's ability to regenerate itself is so poor. Only in one other organ of the body do you have such low levels of cellular proliferation, and that's the brain, which I would find quite bizarre, really, because when we think of the two most important organs of the body, they are the heart and the brain, and these two organs are also the ones which have the lowest capacity for regeneration, basically. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, so if you've had a myocardial infarction, then a huge great lump of the cardiac tissue will have died, and you're not going to be able to replace this with new cardiac tissue. Instead, what's going to happen is it's going to be replaced with connective tissue. So you'll get fibroblasts coming in here, and they'll just produce connective tissue to fill in the gap. So you basically get a huge great scar here. Okay, but that's not going to be able to actually contract, so it's not capable of helping with the job of the left ventricle, which is to expel blood into the aorta. So this means that the rest of the cells of the left ventricle are going to have a harder time, because this great big lump isn't contributing at all, basically. So a heart attack could also mean that the rest of the left ventricle is struggling. Now, when the left ventricle struggles to expel the blood into the aorta, what's going to happen? Well, basically, the stroke volume, which is the volume of blood that is expelled into the aorta every time the left ventricle contracts, that's going to be lower. So stroke volume will go down. And if stroke volume goes down, then it means that the amount of blood that is left over in the left ventricle after it's contracted will go up. Now, there's a fancy name for the amount of blood that is left in the heart after it's contracted, or in the left ventricle specifically after it's contracted. And this is known as the end systolic volume. Okay, so this is the fancy name for the amount of blood that is left within the left ventricle at the end of systole, which is the fancy word for contraction. Okay, so systole means contraction. So this is from systole, which means is a fancy word for contraction. So the end systolic volume is the amount of blood that is left in the left ventricle after it has fully contracted. So the end systolic volume is going to go up, basically. Okay, and do you think the left atrium is going to stop pumping blood into the left ventricle because the left ventricle is failing? Well, no is the answer. So let me say that again. So basically, the left ventricle is now pumping less blood into the aorta, but basically what will happen is the left atrium will still pump the same amount of blood as it was doing into the left ventricle, which means that gradually the left ventricle is going to accumulate more and more blood, because the left atrium is providing the same amount of blood into it, but the amount it's expelling has gone down. Okay, so this is going to mean that the another fancy term, the end diastolic volume goes up. So what does this mean? Well, diastole is the fancy word for relaxation of the heart, okay? So the end diastolic volume is the amount of blood that you have in the left ventricle at the end of the relaxation period for the left ventricle. So it's the amount of blood in the left ventricle just before it contracts. So just to revise, the end diastolic volume is the amount of blood in the left ventricle just before it contracts. The end systolic volume is the amount of blood in the left ventricle just after it's finished contracting. So the difference between these two is the amount of blood that the heart ejects, which is the stroke volume. Okay, so the amount that it ejects is the stroke volume. Okay, now if the end diastolic volume is going up, then basically the stretch on the wall of the heart is going up, and that means that the stress on the heart wall is going to go up. So basically stress is just how much force the heart wall is feeling per unit area, basically. So it's how much the heart is feeling, how much force the heart wall is feeling. Okay, so the stress on the heart wall is going to go up if you increase the volume of blood within the chamber. Okay, right, and this then drives what's known as a pathological remodeling of the wall of the left ventricle. So we're going to now get pathological remodeling, which is going to lead to pathological cardiac hypertrophy. So what's going to happen? Well, the heart is trying to help, basically. It wants to try and solve this problem. And the problem is that the heart is too weak, basically, to pump the correct amount of blood out into the aorta for whatever reason, whether it's that you've had a large portion that's infarcted, or if it's that aortic blood pressure is too high. So what is the solution to this? Well, we need to make the heart stronger. We need the heart to be able to contract with a greater force. So what it starts to do is it starts to hypertrophy the cells of the heart. So it's going to make the heart grow, basically. But I've told you that the heart doesn't have dividing cells. So the heart cannot grow by hyperplasia. Instead, what must happen is every single one of the cells in the heart must actually expand, and that's what hypertrophy is. Okay, so we'll talk about this in the next video.